Good evening and welcome. Tonight I am excited to talk to author Carlos Xavier about his new booklet, Jesus Practiced What He Preached, the New Covenant Law of Messiah. And it should be hitting the shelves before the end of the year, Lord willing. How many of you have ever thought about the New Covenant of Messiah? I know when I grew up, I only heard about the Old Covenant given to Moses. Everybody knows about the 10 Commandments. But I never really had heard about the commands that Messiah gave. How many really know about the Messiah's commandments that he gave to us? And have you ever asked the question, did Jesus really practice what he preached? I was blessed to proofread this booklet, and I will say that it was a very easy read and very well written. It was clear and succinct. So let's talk to Carlos and find out why he wrote this booklet and what it means for those who are seeking to follow Messiah Jesus. Welcome, Carlos.
Good evening, Tracy. Thank you for hosting.
Oh, I'm really excited to hear about it. And like I said, I was thrilled to have read it, and I can't wait till other people can read it as well.
Thank you, and thank you for helping us out.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, would you begin by sharing what inspired you to write this booklet and why you wrote it? Why is this topic so important to you?
Well, almost 10 years ago now, I was actually doing one of many sermonettes we do, as you know, on a weekly basis. And I was reading through actually the letters of Paul, specifically the letter of known as Colossians and the letter known as Galatians. And I noticed this phrase that Paul kept using, which is variously translated as elementary principles of this world, or something like spiritual forces of this dark world, depending on your translation. And that phrase appears specifically in Colossians chapter 2 and in Galatians, I believe in chapter 5, 4 or 5, I forget now. And it's specific, I should say, to Colossians 2, though. Paul is using that phrase, it seemed to me at the time, to teach that, paganism, as most of us Christians know, is bad, is demonic, is evil. But in Colossians chapter 2, right smack in the middle of that chapter, you'll notice that Paul cites the what's known as the Jewish calendar. So, for example, I'll just read it here. He says in Colossians 2, verse 16, therefore, do not let anyone try to judge you or exercise authority over you in regard to what you eat, food, and what you drink. Or, says Paul, in the matter of holy days, monthly new moons, and the weekly Sabbath. And then in verse 17, he says that this calendar, it's known as a Jewish trio calendar, is a single shadow, he says, of what was to come. And by contrast to that, he says the reality or the substance, depending on your translation, is the Messiah. The Jewish calendar there is portrayed in a very negative sense, so much so that he warns Christians not to let anyone judge you whether you are keeping those things. Now, those things like holidays, Jewish holidays, monthly new moons, and the weekly Sabbath, obviously they're essential to the what's known as the Torah or the law of Moses given at Sinai, as you know. So Paul there, to most Christians, is portraying those things in the negative sense. He goes on to say in Colossians chapter 2, he actually uses that phrase twice, the elementary or elemental spirit forces of the world in verse 20. So those things, including paganism, so he's dealing with two issues there, Paul, are bad. And not just bad, but they're evil. They belong now to the so-called dark world, or the elementary principles or the spiritual forces that govern this, as Paul calls it elsewhere, this present evil age. And I was stunned. I was like, am I really understanding here what Paul is saying? So I checked with our esteemed father in the faith, Anthony Buzzard, and I checked the dictionaries, commentaries. I checked with people like you at the time and others. And yeah, we were all sort of in agreement. So then the idea came to me, okay, if that's what Paul is saying, isn't he condemning Jesus, who, for the most part, I've heard, kept the law of Moses, because obviously he was a Jew, he was born under the law, he was obviously circumcised as a baby, he was taken to the temple, as we know the story. So what does that say about Jesus now? Is Paul condemning Jesus here? And if you call yourself a Christian, which means a follower of Messiah, follower of Christ, well, why aren't all of us keeping the law? Well, the general principle in Christianity, Catholic Protestant system, is that, well, the cross took care of all that. So the cross sort of magically breaks the, as my wife puts it, breaks the spell of the law, the Torah, that was given at Sinai. And now the churches and Christians should not be, keeping those things that belong now to this system that is made void by the cross. So the cross now is central to this. But then I asked, well, what about the teachings of Jesus, though? Shouldn't we go back before the cross? What was Jesus doing before the cross? So this universally accepted Christian and non-Christian view, it seemed to me, was sort of a misreading of many, many verses in the New Testament, in the Gospels themselves.
Well, and Carlos, too, we always want to make sure that we let people know in no way are we saying that Jesus was a sinner when we're talking about this topic. Because a lot of people are shocked and they say, oh, what are you saying? Jesus is a sinner? No, we're not. We're saying that he actually practiced what he preached, right?
Right. So the title of the book, Jesus Practiced What He Preached, was a question in my mind that if then Jesus is a Torah observant Jew, as it's known, he's a law keeper because he was born under the law, and in that way he fulfilled the law. So people read Matthew 5:17, right, where Jesus says, I did not come to, you know abolish the law, do away with the law, I came to fulfill it. So most of Christianity would understand the word fulfill there in Matthew 5:17 as, oh, he fulfilled it, Jesus, by keeping the law and keeping it perfectly, and then he died, and it magically breaks the spell of the law for Christians after the cross.
And that's kind of what my view was growing up, but I never really thought of it. It's just something you don't think about, and that's what you think. And so I think it's great that you're getting people thinking about this. Some people might ask, why a booklet? Why isn't it longer? And I personally think you addressed it fantastically there, and there really isn't need for more words. But what did you find in the length of the book in terms of what you included there?
Well, I think I try and cover in a very, as you put it in your good intro, succinct,
Mm-hmm.
way, uh, things, and it's sort of the booklet, more of a booklet. It'll be maybe less than 100 pages, so it's not a massive tome. But it's a sort of also collection of all the sermonettes, all the studies I've done for almost the last 10 years now. And yeah, it's important, I think, to put it in very short and succinct ways that people can grasp. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not having to dig through it and try to figure out what you're saying. It was very well said. So, what research did you do to conduct, for this booklet? You mentioned talking to different people, and when you were doing that, did you uncover anything that was maybe surprising to you?
yeah, so the research involved is, as usual with most of my sermonettes, I'm a sucker, as they say, for reading commentaries, standard commentaries, your theological dictionary of the New Testament or the Old Testament, depending on what I'm doing, word biblical commentary. So I like to skim through those, depending. But yeah, I talk to people like you, obviously Anthony, my family, my wife, obviously. And then, yeah, just check different sources. And that's, yeah, that's very important, right? Because no Christian should be an island. I don't know everything, and I may get some things wrong. I may be misreading something. I don't have degrees in the biblical Hebrew or Greek, so Anthony is a great benefit to all of us, I think, to as a sounding board, if you will. And he has a lot to offer, and other people as well that I serve as. I'd like to thank my advisors, counselors. So yeah, it's very important to grow, to work in a community, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
not just alone. So
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you mentioned, scholars, and there are a lot of scholars that have this wrong too. So just because somebody's a scholar doesn't mean they have it right. And I know Anthony says often, if somebody came up with an idea and they're the only one who's ever had this idea from hundreds of thousands of years ago until today, you might need to question it if it's, some new revelation that just you have and nobody else has ever even thought of that.
well, if I may, about the scholars. So for the most part, these are Trinitarian publications.
Mm-hmm.
We are not Trinitarians. We are non-Trinitarians or biblical Unitarians. So I'm not obviously endorsing everything that dictionaries, lexicons of that ilk have to
Mm-hmm.
say about other topics. But even in this topic, as you say, they get some things wrong. And it's interesting, Tracy, because whether they're Catholic or Protestant um, background scholars, who again, for the most part, are not so-called Sabbatarians. For the most part, Catholics, Protestants, so-called evangelicals, they don't keep Sabbath, they don't keep food laws in general.
Mm-hmm.
There are millions of self-professing Christians who do, who either keep Sabbath. Food laws is generally the Sabbatarian system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very few sort of go all the way and go back to circumcision of the flesh, for example.
Right.
Very
And there
few,
are those who are Trinitarian and Unitarian that do that, unfortunately.
right? So
So what
what's
was
interesting?
oh, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry. So what's interesting about the Catholic and Protestant scholarship on this is that yes, they're not Sabbatarians. They don't believe in the new covenant. They believe we are under a new covenant, not the old covenant of Sinai. But at the same time, I found that in my research, they will say things like, well, when Jesus heals on the Sabbath or does a good quote work on the Sabbath, these scholars will say he's not breaking Sabbath. So they have there's a sort of dichotomy there I found, because on the one hand, again, these Catholic Protestant scholars are not Sabbatarians, yet they're defending Jesus as if he kept the Sabbath, as if he continued in law keeping. So which is it? Again, I go back to the question, which is the title of the book. Which is it? So if Jesus came to preach new covenant, as again most of scholarship agrees, and I agree, did he practice then what he preached? Because when you read the scholars, even your study Bibles, you'll note, especially, for example, in John chapter 5, which is a very important passage, and it features prominently in my book. I did a lot of work on John chapter 5.
Mhm.
Just to give you a brief outline, Jesus is healing on the Sabbath once again. By the way, in the Gospel of John, he's recorded Jesus as healing many times, almost 10 times, I believe. And I think it is on purpose that John, the writer, does this. In other words, he's sort of making a point that he's doing these things on the Sabbath on purpose. Anyway, in John chapter 5, Jesus goes on to say, because the Pharisees, obviously, who are always looking for something to get him on, to argue with, etc., they say, hey, you're breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus says in John 5, verse 17, that his Father is working to that day, the Sabbath day, and I too am working. So that's John 5:17. And then the following verse, John, the writer, says, for that reason, they were trying all the more to kill Jesus because he was breaking the Sabbath. So the writer, John, well understood what that Jesus was breaking the Sabbath, but he's not a sinner, as you say, because Jesus says his Father is working and I'm working. He said, in other words, the authority that the Father has, obviously, God the Father does not keep Sabbath. Well, I don't keep Sabbath. You see what's happening there? So it's about authority, and he's now Lord of the Sabbath, as Jesus goes
Mm-hmm.
on to say in Mark chapter 2 and other places,
Mm-hmm.
meaning the word Lord, if you remember, simply means in that context, master, owner.
Mm-hmm.
So he owns the day now. And as a result, John understood that he was breaking the Sabbath because obviously Jesus is taking on himself, let's say, the authority that belong only to God the Father. So
Mm-hmm.
that is a very important passage in John chapter 5 that people have to think about, really, because scholarship and your study Bibles might say something like, oh, no, no, he wasn't breaking the Sabbath, Jesus. Something else is happening. Sorry. So thanks.
Right. And like you mentioned before about the cross and this and that, and Sharon mentioned in the chat there about Jesus's blood being poured out, that's the seal of that covenant. I mean, that is, I think, one of the most important things that I learned from your other studies and things that we've done is that, and what Sarah says, your wife, you have to have something in writing, a covenant, in order to seal it. You don't just stamp a document with no words on it. And the covenant of Moses, God gave him words, he gave them to the people. They agreed, they offered a sacrifice. And the same thing with Jesus. The whole ministry, he was giving us the words. He said, I only speak what the Father has given me to speak. So he's giving this new covenant of Messiah. And then in the end here, he seals it with his blood.
To Sharon's point there, yes, there is a chapter in the book actually specific to what the writer of Hebrews has to say about the blood. And I think the big mistake, as he alluded to, Tracy, is to say that the blood is the covenant.
Mhm.
No, the blood is not the covenant. There's no verse that says that actually, that the blood
Mhm.
is the covenant.
Mhm.
What happens is, as you say, is the words are the covenant, and the blood is used as a ratification, as a
Right.
sort of, think of a stamp of approval. So the good example that I believe maybe you gave me or someone else is Moses.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yep.
so Moses goes up the mountain, Mount Sinai, and brings down the tablets, representative, by the way, of the whole law that is to follow, hundreds of laws. So he comes down and says, here you go, Israel, right? This is now the
Mhm.
law. And then Moses speaks
Right.
the words of the covenant, and then he says to the people, choose.
Right.
So, in other words, the covenant is right there, not only being spoken, but enforced. So, and there's no bloodshed yet. It goes on to say, Exodus, the book of Exodus, you'll find this. I don't know how much later, but later, you get the so-called ratification. He takes the blood of animals and he sprinkles it on the people, by the way, which is interesting, which
Mhm.
is all symbolic, obviously.
Mhm.
But you have to have words to do that. So the blood
Mhm.
is not the covenant. The covenant are the words of Jesus, which we cover in the book.
Amen. Yeah, that was the one thing that when I was doing my own research, because like you said, you wanted to, not just listen to somebody. And the same with me. When you were presenting this, I went back and I was doing my own study, and that was the one thing that really stuck out to me. So, Carlos, what do you think was the most challenging part of writing this booklet?
I'm very blessed. We do this, you and I, full time. So I'm full time in the ministry. So I don't have another job where you have to do other jobs and then come back home, make time for your other job, which is pastoring and so on. So I'm very blessed. I have uh, a lot of time here. And again, the most challenging thing is, well, first it was accepting what Paul was saying about aspects of the old, what we call the old covenant, the Jewish calendar I mentioned, college. So that was massive, Trace. I was like, God forgive me if I'm wrong here. It
Mhm.
was a very crucial moment in my spiritual life,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to sin, obviously, on purpose. So
Right.
I'm going, man, I gotta check this. I can't just jump to conclusions. So that was very challenging to me. And the other just practical challenge of writing books or booklets is, the work. Ordering the chapters, compiling all the stuff you've done, because it's really a collection of almost 10 years of work of study and writings that I do. So compiling, collecting, putting it in some kind of order, and then working with people like yourself, that takes weeks, months, and we hope that the book will be out sometime in the fall. So
Right. Well, yeah, and then when you're doing this, like I know you've shared your wife does a lot of work with you too, and so it's putting another burden on her as well. It's like this is your thing, but because you're doing it, it puts more work on her as well. And so yeah, that can be challenging too because it's not just about you. So how did you choose a title for this booklet? I really like it. And what significance does it hold for you for the booklet?
well, thank you. I mean, titles are very important. They capture the eyeball, the attention. So you want that, right? You want to propagate the faith. By the way, it's not some. We don't write books. We don't publish books to make money. Really, it's to obviously spread the sound doctrine that we believe in. So the title is a reworking of that question I asked myself all those years ago. Well, if Jesus was sent to preach the new covenant, why am I reading a study Bible, commentaries, hearing pastors on TV, Christians say that Jesus remained Torah observant or kept the law of Moses? So it's a reworking of that. Like, okay, if he practiced what he preached, or did he? So if he preached new covenant, but he didn't practice it, well, we know what that is called, a hypocrite. So it's the it's the old, do what I say, don't do what I do. Because if he's saying, well, I'm saying new covenant, sometimes changing the old laws, you have heard it said, but I say the Sermon on the Mount, oh, but I'm not doing it, or you don't have to do it yet. You have to wait till I die or something.
He never said that for what I'm giving you is for the future, for some other time. He was speaking and saying, this is what you should do.
Well, yeah, he asked, if you remember, at one time Jesus said, you call me Lord, Lord, but you don't do what I say.
Right,
Well, that
right.
doesn't sound like, oh, hold on, everyone, wait till I die, wait till the blood is poured out of the new covenant, and then, we're good. And the
Right.
significance is massive, right, Tracy?
Mhm.
Because the significance of this crosses all denominational Christian lines. Whether, again, you come from a Catholic, Protestant, or even Unitarian tradition, non-Trinitarian tradition, right? Irrespective of current or past denominational backgrounds, the questions we pose in this book and the answers or the positions I take in the book, the arguments I make for those positions should be life-changing for you,
Mhm.
because it redefines the whole ministry of Jesus. It redefines your understanding of, as Sharon put in the comments, the blood. So is the blood the covenant? Is the covenant the blood? Do I have this right? Well, my goal is that you will, be forced to go back and listen to Jesus. Not so
Mhm.
much myself. I'm just pointing you back to Jesus. Study his words, listen to very carefully to what he says, what he does. So it's not only listen to Jesus, but watch in your mind, obviously, in your mind's eye, what Jesus did.
Amen. Amen. And how did you approach then the revisions and editing? Because obviously, like you said, it was a compilation of sermons and teachings and study and all this. So how did you end up putting that together and editing it? And how has the manuscript of the booklet evolved throughout that whole process?
Well, it's still evolving.
Yes.
uh, we talked earlier, Tracy, and another brother in the faith is a huge help. He's going through the book because what you want, by the way, going back to I guess the previous question, uh, if you're writing a booklet or a book, if you're thinking of it, also have in mind people who can proofread it, people who you trust, who have helped you, etc. You have trust with and confidence with. uh, Give them the manuscript, have someone read it. Again, you're not you should not be no Christian is an island or should not be an island. So
Hmm.
share what you're writing. It's very important. So it's still a work in progress. There's lots of proofreading and revisions being done as we speak, although the core ideas are you've already read. And
Hmm.
most my wife always reminds me, because she's a professional proofreader. My wife, she does this obviously for a living as well, and she reminds me that most major publications have at least eight different proofreaders. So
Hmm.
it's a huge task, but don't be, daunted by it. Don't be overwhelmed by what I'm saying. Good things take work. And if you're passionate, if you believe it's from God, if you believe in your soul, in your bones, that this is the truth, I'm sure, you'll be motivated regardless. So the approach is to go from a mini booklet to a longer book form, but I think the size that it's reaching, just under 100 pages, is I think it's pretty good.
Hmm. Well, and like you said, with all the eyes on it too, it really is a group effort there. It's not just something that came out of Carlos. So a lot of people have invested in it as well. And speaking of that, is there anybody that you would like to acknowledge, which I hope you'll start with your dear wife?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my wife, I call her my teacher, by the way. I'm not embarrassed. I'm not ashamed to say that my wife really is my teacher. Some of you know my story. I was not born in the church. I did not grow in a church. She did. So she's decades ahead of me when it comes to that. So, she's obviously my primary go-to. Obviously, our spiritual father, Anthony Buzzard, yourself, and others. So I do have an acknowledgments page, as they call it, in the booklet, and yeah. So there are many other proofreaders like yourself, and we really appreciate all the help.
Hmm. Right. And so, what do you hope that readers will take away from your booklet once they read it?
To go back, like I said, to the teachings of Jesus. Christian. I did a sermonette recently, Tracy. If you remember, I called it the gospel of the cross,
Mm.
because especially here, we are in the United States, by the way. In this country, it's all about the cross. Now, the cross is obviously important. The resurrection of our Jesus, who we believe is the Messiah, the anointed one, the promised one, uh, who the Old Testament prophets and kings and everyone wrote about. It's obviously essential. But what happened before the cross? So uh, I hope that readers go back to the Sermon on the Mount, which is the beginning of the new covenant, really, officially, right? It sort of begins in a embryonic form, in a pre-form with John the Baptist. He's a central figure, and they are the messengers of the new covenant, John and Jesus. And I think they are the ones Malachi spoke about in Malachi chapter 3 and 4. I think they are those people. Obviously, Jesus is the Messiah, we believe as Christians. So my hope is that, instead of majoring in Paul and minoring in Jesus, my hope is that we major with Jesus and minor in Paul. Because again, another thing in scholarship, Tracy, and you'll hear this, around Easter time or Christmas time in those awful documentaries from History Channel and and other atheists. You'll hear stuff like, well, you have all these PhDs musing and wondering to the camera. Well, the real founder of Christianity is Paul. You've heard that a lot. So don't major in Paul. Again, Paul is not some bad guy. Obviously, he's not some false apostle. He's an apostle, the 13th apostle. But major in Jesus first. Because remember, Paul at one time said, imitate me as I imitate Messiah Jesus. Paul said, you know, I learned these things. I'm convinced of these things in Jesus. That's Romans 14, 14. When it comes to all foods that are clean, Paul says. So yeah, my hope is that you major with Jesus and minor with Paul and the other apostles, because for Christendom, for Christianity in general, the gospel is the cross, period. End of discussion. Everything is about the blood, but the question is, well, what about what Jesus said and what Jesus did?
Well, and if you don't know what that is, there's really no point to the blood either, because how do you even know what that even means then? And so I
Right.
appreciate that you're not saying just look at what I'm saying. You're pointing people back to Christ and saying, consider what Jesus said, consider what he taught, and let's move on from there. So
Yeah.
Carlos,
Sorry,
go
and we
ahead.
learned,
Yeah.
and I learned that from Anthony Buzzard, right? What's he always say? You
Mhm.
know, the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, as
Right.
he repeats himself.
Yes.
Christianity, you know, is founded. Well, first, it's founded on this post-biblical idea of the Trinity, post-biblical idea of quote hell. You know, when you die, your disembodied self goes down there or up there.
Mm-hmm.
So Christianity is founded, as Anthony always says, not on the words of Jesus. It's always about later councils, the so-called church fathers, or what your pastor on a Sunday says. No,
Mm-hmm.
no. Let's go back, as Anthony always teaches us, to the words of Jesus. And that really was a good foundation for me when I came to this topic
Right.
and read, you know, Paul first. And then I said, well, man, I have to go back to Jesus, because I don't want to be wrong here and think that Paul is somehow condemning Jesus if,
Mm-hmm.
if Jesus kept the law, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Amen. So Carlos, when do you think the book will be in print? You mentioned the fall, and how can people get a copy of this booklet?
Well, like I said, in the fall, sometime in the fall, we're still working on it. So I appreciate you bringing attention to this now. Today, by the way, is August 8th, 2025. So, you know, October, hopefully end of October, certainly by November, I hope we have. And just go to our focus on the kingdom.org website, and we have a link that says books, and we should have it available through Amazon as well. So you can just Google the title with my name, or just go to our website, focusonthekingdom.org. I'm also working at the same time, Tracy, on an audio version
Mm-hmm.
of the booklet. As you know, that's very popular nowadays. So I'm getting, actually today I recorded Anthony's forward. Anthony has a forward in the booklet. I appreciate that.
Great.
And so probably the audio book will come out first, and that'll be free, by the way, for free. So we'll get
Mm-hmm.
that out there. But if you want a physical copy, go to focusonthekingdom.org and click on books, or just through Amazon should be available.
Do you think you'll have a Kindle version too, or
Yep, we'll work on a Kindle, and
okay, some read
we'll
that way?
yeah, we'll try and get all of the formats out at the same time. Yeah.
All right. Well, again,
Um, my
yeah.
bro, sorry, my bro, NJ Nelson. How you doing, bro? Is it in Spanish? Actually, yes. I'm having a brother who does Spanish translations. So there will be a Spanish version. Again, look for all those things, the physical stuff. The audiobook again should be out before, sometime before, but we're looking at October, November.
Awesome. Be looking forward to that. So, again, personally, I've really been blessed by this topic of study. We've had many different studies on it in our various Bible study groups over the past few years. And I'm grateful that you brought this important topic to my attention personally. and that you took the time to write the booklet, because myself and probably others aren't as familiar with the topic. So if you're talking to people, you'll be able to share it. Are there any last words that you would like to say?
Yes, let's go back to Jesus. Let's go back to the teachings of Jesus. Again, Jesus was very clear. He was unambiguous. He said, you know, you call me Lord, Lord, but you're not doing what I'm telling you. So it's very important to, you know, as you read the words of Jesus, picture him in your mind and picture what he's saying to you. So picture yourself at that time in first century AD Judea, in Jerusalem, and you know, watching Jesus there teaching you these things, so you can read his words, you can picture his words, uh, picture hearing his words, and then think to yourself, should I do what he's telling me now? So is this now the new thing, or is this for a later time?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, as important as the cross is, and we preach the cross as well, we preach the death of Messiah, the resurrection, the blood of the covenant, as important as that is, what is the covenant though? What did Jesus say and what did Jesus do?